He's a CTO as well, right? Yeah, so an engineer as well. And he has an awesome book about startup patterns that he wrote as well. He'll tell you all about it. But yeah, I'll let you Sam introduce himself, and
Sure.
let's jump in it.
Okay, I'm not going to use the mic. It's okay. All right, this is on, so I'm good. All right, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming. I appreciate your showing up at getting to product market fit quickly.
So let's make sure that everyone can hear you.
Yeah, can everybody hear me in the back? I will project. I'll talk to you directly so that, make sure I pick it over the back.
If you guys have a hard time hearing at any point, raise your hand and I'll give them the mic, okay?
Yeah, if you have a hard time hearing, I'll be surprised. But just in case, let me know. And also, let's make this somewhat interactive. We'll have time for questions at the end. I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground in a lot of different areas. So it's going to be a bit of drinking from the fire hose. But if you want to interrupt and ask a question, that's perfectly okay. Just let me know. But then we'll have some more time for discussion, and I can give as many additional examples as possible in the time remaining. And I'm happy to stick around for as long as you guys want. So let me give you some idea of what we're going to talk about, and then I'll introduce myself a little bit in more detail. So our agenda here is, I'll introduce myself. We're going to talk sort of about these kind of three main areas. I don't know if these are necessarily the best buckets for organizing this material. There's lots of different ways to slice it, but this is how I did it on this particular slide deck. So we've got solving the right problem, right? So products are supposed to solve problems for people, presumably. Building that product very quickly. So that's all a lot about teamwork and sort of some engineering principles and some workflow stuff. And then there's sort of dealing with competition is a little bit of thinking about how your product is positioned among the universe of other products out there in your space. But even in there, you'll see there's a lot of other topics that we could divert into for a moment or two if there's some specific questions that you have. So also, while you guys were introducing yourselves, I did take some notes about what people are interested in getting out of this, and I will try to use that and address as many of those things as possible. I don't know if we'll have time to get to everything, but let's try to make this as valuable for you guys as we can. So this is me. So I'm Sam McAfee, as you already know. I've been out here in the Bay Area. I'm originally from the East Coast, but I moved to the Bay Area almost exactly 20 years ago. And I've been in the tech scene for 18 years. I have an engineering background, so the way that I got into the tech scene was I was out here actually originally with a background as an undergrad in the social sciences and fancied myself getting some sort of job in research or policy or some sort of nonprofit or something like that, and found that it was extremely difficult to survive in the Bay Area doing that stuff. And all of my friends had moved out to the Bay Area for this sort of .com thing that was going on that I didn't really know that much about. And so, I was the guy that would always have to borrow money for pizza from all the other guys. And so eventually they sort of cajoled me into, hey, Sam, you can probably get a job at one of these web companies if you just learn a little bit of web development, a little HTML. So I went out and I got the O'Reilly Webmaster in a Nutshell book that had sort of the basics, and took a picture of myself holding the book, and I posted it on Craigslist and got like 100 job offers the next day. So that's kind of what it was like back then. I'm kidding a little bit, but only just. So I kind of got swept into the scene as a self-taught web developer, and that sort of led into sort of building a team around myself, because I was particularly good at bringing in work, because I have decent communication skills, unlike a lot of other people that I was competing with for those jobs. And so that sort of morphed into building this web agency that took up a big chunk of my career so far. The first 12 years or so, we're doing a lot of custom consulting work, web development projects of various kinds from about 2000 to 2012. So during that time, I was a very early adopter in the process realm of Agile. So that's extreme programming, Scrum, like all that stuff for me was the way you do it. Like my career happened to align really nicely with the birth of Agile. So for me, that's always just been how things are done, because when I started Googling around for how do you manage software teams and projects, Agile is the stuff that I found. So that was very natural for me. So I got really into it. And at a later time, I also got early exposure to the ideas of Steve Blank and Eric Ries, so customer development, lean startup, and I was at the conferences before the book came out. I've kind of been in that community helping to, run conferences and help to be, a speaker or a host in that community for a long time. I've sort of jumped back and forth between doing startups myself with friends or being an early person coming on board as a technical hire with consulting kind of in between. So I sort of jumped from being in the trenches and being very tactical and building products with other people. And when I'm not doing that, I'm usually going around sort of coaching or teaching or consulting with companies that have engineering teams or product teams that need help. So I kind of jump back and forth. I'm currently in between, for example. So I've spent the last year doing a bunch of freelance gigs as a coach or a consultant, kind of waiting for that next new thing to come along. There's a seventh startup that's sort of running in the background that I'm working on right now, but we're looking for product market fit too. So it sometimes takes some time. Yeah.
When you say startup, is that yours or is that the client?
It's been a combination. Oh, in that sense. So when I have this sort of done 6 startups, that means that I was either a co-founder or a very sort of early technical hire, like one of 5 or 10 people in the beginning, really kind of building it from scratch, right? So not as a client, but as like a core team member. And then the rest of the stuff has been as more of a consultant-client relationship. So some of that has been at very large companies. I've worked with some big enterprise companies as well that have been trying to embrace agile and lean startup approaches to building products in their engineering teams, which is actually a hard thing to do for large organizations, and we can talk more about that if you want. And then, of course, I did find the time over the last couple of years to write this book, which I was delighted to hear that at least one of you has already read, which is awesome. I appreciate that. And so a lot of what I go through in here is sort of related to what's in the book. And I'm actually working on a course, like an online sort of video-based course that'll probably be ready sometime in the fall that'll have a lot of the same material as well. Just trying to scale myself, So let's get into product market fit. So I have a particular definition that I like to use as far as like what do we actually mean by product market fit, right? So the way that I think about it is essentially this. A product, to be successful in the market, it needs to be solving a really existing painful problem for a really existing customer segment. And what I mean by that is you can actually find these people. Like it's a way of segmenting the market around behaviors, demographics, aspirations and problems, and you can identify them as a chunk of the market that are fairly similar with regard to the problems that they have, and that you can create a solution that will solve that problem for them. And so this sort of second piece is the recommendation that given that any time that you've had an idea about a problem that you can solve in the market, it's almost guaranteed that 100 other people somewhere on the planet also have had the same idea. So speed to market is absolutely essential, right? So it's very essential that you solve that problem very effectively, right? So that you actually do solve the problem and that the customer recognizes that it's your product that has solved the problem. And they're willing to either buy more of it or continue subscribing to it or whatever the monetization model is that you have, and that you do it faster than the competitors or better than the competitors or both, ideally, right? And so we talk a little bit about making it difficult for anyone to catch up with you. That's sort of vague and abstract, but we'll get into the details of kind of what that means. It actually has a lot less to do with paying attention to the competition than it has to do with paying attention to your customer and their problems, it turns out. And just a quick word on product strategy. I think it's worth noting that the stuff that I do is really around early stage product development, right? So it's sort of, it might be a startup that's just getting started, or it might be an initiative within a larger company that's trying to break into a new market or create some new product or service in an area that they're not particularly used to yet, or their customers, they're maybe selling to a new customer base. You can use it either way, but in these new products, how many people here are familiar with the rather clumsy term, but used a lot, MVP, or minimal viable product? So pretty much most of us have heard that term. This is just the idea that the first version of the product that you get out, you want to make it as tightly scoped, as small as possible, but still solving the problem, right? And get it out as fast as possible. And does anyone want to speculate as to why getting an MVP out to the market quickly is a good idea? Like, what does it give you to have an MVP out there?
Customer feedback.
Exactly, right. Learning, right? So you learn about what the market wants. And so the whole idea is you're trying to reduce risks as much as possible. So I'll give you sort of a quick kind of way that I think about this. So before sort of Agile and before Lean Startup, you have sort of the old way of doing things was to spend a lot of time and money and have people build one big version of the product. Maybe it takes a year to release it. And what you're doing here is over time, you're basically building up a level of risk, right? And so you kind of burn that risk down by releasing the product and then getting some feedback about whether people actually want it, whether they're going to buy it or not. Instead, what we're doing these days is doing lots of little releases, right? And getting things out to market more quickly in cumulative iterations, right? So this is what I'm talking about. So this MVP, this first version, would be there. Like you try to get something out there that can capture learning about the market and give you feedback so that the next one is a little bit better and you're adding more scope or more features or you're changing things about the product, right? So all of that being said, there's some vision behind why you're doing this product in the first place. Like presumably if you're an entrepreneur or even a relatively seasoned product manager in a company, whatever the product space that you're in charge of or that you're championing, there's some sort of longer term vision of how you're going to change the world in some way, right? Like we're going to cure cancer or make a better solar panel or whatever the thing is. There's some ultimate reason why you're doing it. And it might take you more than just the MVP, probably, to get to that vision. It might be like a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan, who knows? And the thing that you have to keep in mind is that whatever this MVP looks like, it won't necessarily look that much like your whole vision. It'll be one small part of it, most likely, right? So you've got this goal, your vision out here, and you're starting here, right? And you're going to be following some path, right, through different iterations that might be windy before you get to your grand vision, right? So all of that is based on sort of what your overall product strategy is, right? And each strategy is different. It relates to whatever space that you're in. But you might say like, okay, we're going to build the ultimate logistics company on the planet. How do we do that? Well, maybe we need to build some sort of business around people sharing rides because that'll enable us to build software to coordinate, drivers and riders, and eventually we can move to autonomous vehicles and drop the drivers, but we'll collect all this data, and so that might be a way to build the ultimate sort of self-driving logistics company, right? Like that might be in your vision. So just wanted you to keep in mind that like you're balancing both short-term and long-term plans all the time, right? All right, so let's get into the specifics of what we're doing when we're solving problems. So solving the right problem. Here are the ways that I think about solving a problem, right? So you have to have a couple of pieces. You have to have a pretty decent model of who your customer is, right? So we talk about modeling the customer using personas. And so I'll show you a little bit about how I do personas. It's pretty straightforward, not very hard. Once you have a persona, once you've developed an understanding of who your customer is, And I typically treat the personas as a kind of hypothesis, right? Like you can do some general research to build a persona, but basically your persona is kind of like, are there people like this and do they have the problems that we think they have? And then you would go and talk to them and you would find out, right? Through a series of problem interviews, right? And then after that, you would do solution interviews. And I'll go through each of these. So let me show you what I mean specifically. So when you're talking about a customer, the way that I learned this, and this is in the book in a little bit more detail, a customer persona basically is just a quick sketch of this customer, right? So it's like what you typically do is you try to come up with a fictional archetype of a customer. It could be, it could be a salesperson, it could be a soccer mom, it could be like any sort of general category that you're trying to sell to. And the way that I learned this from a woman named Janice Frazier, who's a really wonderful speaker and mentor and has been around the product space for a long time. She actually started this company where I was the VP of engineering for a little while. So Janice taught a particular way of doing a persona that's taking one simple 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper and a Sharpie, and basically you kind of break it into 4 boxes, and you do a little sketch of your customer in one box, and that's important, actually. It's important because anyone want to take a stab at why sketching is a good part of this process? Wild guess? It has to do with the brain. No? All right, I'll just tell you. All right. So you're kind of exercising the creative side of your brain, which just helps you sort of build empathy with your customer. It helps you kind of go to places neurologically where you're not typically going when you're very analytical, right? So the sketching helps you kind of get out of that analytical space. And then you basically fill in demographics in this area, behaviors, and there's different ways to do this, but this is the way that I learned it. And then sort of goals, aspirations, or problems, depending on how you want to slice it. So the demographics is usually stuff like, an age, married with kids maybe, sort of urban or rural or suburban. And they're demographics that has to do with the problem that you're working in, right? So it's not just like any old demographics. It's demographics that are relevant for your particular space, right? So. And then the behaviors are basically related to things that are around the problem that you're trying to solve. So if you're trying to make a sales tool, for example, you would be talking about your salesperson persona. You give it a name, like Jack, and you draw a picture of this fictional Jack, who's sort of a representation of all the Jacks that are out there, right? And Jack is, living in the city, and he's 32, and he has a dog, and he's single or whatever, and what are the behaviors that Jack has? Well, he currently uses Salesforce, but he hates it or whatever, right? So you're figuring out these behaviors, and then you might itemize like specific problems that Jack has that your app in your mind might solve, right? So you create this persona as kind of a hypothesis, right? It's a way of saying, I think the customers are like this. Now I'm going to go out into the world, and I'm going to try to find people like this, right? I'm going to go find all the Jacks I can, you could start with maybe 10 or 20. And what you do is you do problem interviews. So you might have noticed that I have, actually let me give you a few more of these persona tips just to kind of summarize that. So for me, personas, when you're doing them, the simplest thing is don't use high tech if you don't have to, right? Like use the simplest tool that'll work. So I'm often, as you can see, pulling out my Sharpies and my paper and my sticky notes just because it's fast, it's cheap, it's easy. I don't have to open a whole software program. I don't necessarily want to save it. It's really just getting the brain juices out onto paper so I can look at them and interact with the thoughts, right? So paper and Sharpies is good. Always include a sketch just to get your brain out of that tight analytical space. Demographics should be relevant. Behaviors should be relevant. And don't use real people. Don't model a persona off of the one customer that you're always thinking about, because that'll sort of give you some false signals around what customers are really like. You do kind of want to generalize, right? So when you do the problem interviews, we're going to get into problem interviews. what you're trying to do is you're trying to validate that the customer actually has the problems that you think they do. And I strongly suggest that you separate problem interviews from solution interviews, right? Why might that be the case? Why would you go validate the problem first before you go through a process of talking to people about a solution? Any ideas? Thoughts? No? Okay. No? Yes? Yeah, go for it.
Then you have more options in terms of creating the solution.
Yeah,
Why you wouldn't?
for sure. Yeah, you have a broader space. There's a sort of a second and kind of related reason, which is if you're building a solution based on the assumption that these people have the problems that you think they have, and you've already started down the path of describing a particular solution, and then you discover that those are actually the wrong problems, they don't actually have them, or they're not that painful, or not painful enough to switch to a new product, it would then affect what solution you should build, right? But maybe you've already invested time in this first solution, but it turns out that that's not really the right solution because really the problems that they have are this other set, right? So part of it is avoiding the waste, right? So it's sort of like, again, it's like breaking down the risk into smaller sub-risks or breaking a big problem into small problems. So for me, I find it really important to try and do problem interviews first because every time I do this, we always think we know exactly what the customer problems were. You know, we have a brainstorming session, we come up with our persona, we list out the problems, we're totally sure that salespeople have a problem with this particular app and our app is going to blow it out of the water. Then we go out and we talk to 25 salespeople and it turns out, aha, yeah, a lot of them have that problem, but they all rate it kind of not so painful. They have this other problem that we're not thinking about at all. Completely changes our mind. That happens in almost every project I do. So thinking about problem interviews specifically, the general format, I don't really show it very well in that picture, I don't think, but the general format is that you've sort of listed out what problems you think they have ahead of time, right? So you're all familiar with the scientific method, right? Like in the scientific method, you state your hypothesis first, and then you run an experiment to collect data, and you compare it to what you said. Why do we do that? Does anybody know why that's really important? Again, it's a brain thing, sort of humans in the brain. Yeah, go for it.
Objectivity.
Totally.
Bias.
Yeah, because if you don't do that, we've found there's volumes of research on this, that people are really good. We are all really good at convincing ourselves that we knew the conclusion already if we didn't clearly state our hypothesis in advance, right? So what I do is I take the problems from our persona and me and my team will put them in order of what we think are the highest ranking problems, like maybe 3 to 5, right? Or however many there are, but try to limit it to like a core amount. And we basically go out and try to disprove it. We try to find data that shows that we're wrong. And so we will go and interview people and we'll ask them, do you have these problems? Yes or no? And if you do, how painful is this problem? You're trying to get like, is this problem painful enough that you'd actually buy a different thing that we're gonna make, right? Or is it like, well, I got Google Docs and it kind of works and it's like not such a big deal and it's annoying, but it's fine, right? Like that's not exactly a ringing endorsement for your idea. So you're really trying to surface those problems in a somewhat quantitative way by asking a bunch of people if they have them, right? So what we do is take our problem sort of scripts and we go and try to hunt down a bunch of these people. So there's some tips here, for example. So one, so has anybody done any customer interviews, like gone out and like grabbed people on the street and talked to them about your product or called them up or anything? You guys have? What was the experience like?
Not necessarily problem, but no solution.
Sure, maybe not exactly like this, but you talked to people and did you find it easy or hard?
It's hard to get them there.
Yeah.
And then the most common emotion is surprise that they're not getting what we thought is easy enough to get.
So you found it useful.
So we spent a lot of time being very surprised why it's not working for them.
Right. Yeah. And you did some too?
Yeah, I was talking about carpooling in '99.
Right, right. Did you drive people around and talk to them in the car?
I
Or?
did that too.
Yeah. That's awesome.
No, yeah, people just gave me 55 different reasons they won't do it, but
Right.
everybody had a different reason.
Right.
But eventually the solutions came out of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it was basically I knew every single reason anybody would ever reject it.
Right.
So that was the answer.
Yeah.
The solutions just presented themselves automatically.
Yeah. So for me, when I'm working with teams as a coach or an advisor, it's amazing how many teams don't just go out and talk to customers, right? Like they are still, in this day and age, 2017, startups are forming all over Silicon Valley, all over the world, hunkered down in a basement with their perfect solution that they know everyone's gonna love, and they just like can't just go outside and grab one person and talk to them about whether they have the problem or not. So we just basically have these simple tips. You know, it's easy. Just like be nice and friendly and go talk to people and say, hey, I'm working on this startup and I'd like to get your feedback about X. You'd be surprised how much people are totally willing to give you their opinion for an hour over a cup of coffee or whatever. So that, it's not hard to do. You're not selling anything at this stage, right? So for the problem interviews, you're really trying to ask them about themselves. It's the solution selling stuff comes later, right? But for this point, we're just trying to validate they have the problems. You can call it research. That's an easy, I'm doing a research project. Can I ask you about your behaviors with X, right? You want to listen more than you talk, right? So you're asking some open-ended questions in the beginning just to kind of get them describing their experience. You save the sort of problem ranking for the end. It's best to do it in pairs because it's really hard to listen while you're taking notes. So I usually have a partner. One of us will take notes, the other one will talk, and we'll switch back and forth. We usually have like a Google Doc that we're both looking at, and we'll just be typing in there while we're interviewing. But that way, like when I'm interviewing a customer, I can really just focus on their body language, how they respond to different things, like the words that they use, and I'm really focused. And my partner's just capturing all this other stuff that, you know, we can compare notes later, right? You want to say like, when there's something that's like a nugget of interestingness there, you want to get them to say more about that. So you always kind of like encourage them to elaborate if there's some particular thing, especially if it's related to what you want to do. You might say, okay, well, tell me a little bit more about that particular problem. Like, how did that affect you? That kind of stuff. And then you want to keep track of different numbers that might come up, like the number of times they do something or how long it's been or those sorts of things. One last tip that I don't have up here that's really important, I don't know why it didn't make it into these slides. It's better to ask them about their historical behavior than to ask them to speculate. People will try to give you answers if you say, would you do this or would you like to? But you get really crap data. You really just want them to tell you, like, when was the last time you bought an app in the App Store, right? Like, what was it for? Did you like it? Do you still use it? Like those kinds of questions, because they can just give you real answers because they're just validated, right? It's not like, oh, well, I think I might like that app, you know, that sort of thing. And I was telling you about separating the problem interviews from the solution interviews. So typically what we'll do is we got personas. We've figured out what we think the problems are. We'll go out with our little scripts and interview 15, 20, 25 people, as many as we can. And we will validate or invalidate some of those problems. What we usually come back with is a slightly different list. It's also important to ask them, this isn't on the slides, but you also want to ask them, are there any other problems that you have that I forgot to ask you about? Right? Like, what other things are you dealing with in this particular environment, right? Because then they'll surface some new things you might not have heard. So once we have a pretty good idea of what the problems are, you know, it might be like, you know, most people have trouble managing their tasks, you know, with their mobile app or whatever. 2, reminders are annoying. You know, whatever those problems were, whatever the results that you got, you'll have sort of a stack ranked list of a bunch of things. Right? So now that's your target for your first solution test. Like now, we're going to design some kind of solution that addresses this problem first, right? Because that's the most people had that problem and ranked it the most painful of the problems they had. And so that will really affect, like we were having this discussion earlier about why you do sort of the problem before the solution, because inevitably, like most founders, you have a vision, you know where you want to go, and the first thing that we all do, I do this just like everyone else, you start sketching out what your beautiful solution is going to look like, right? That's the first thing you do. You all can admit it, right? It's like, okay, my app's going to have this, and there's going to be all these features, and they're going to be awesome. And then you go out and interview all these people, and then like the problems are totally in the inverse order, and your beautiful solution doesn't really address it quite in the way that you expected. So now you got to throw all that out, and you come up with some different mock-ups. So I will typically go through a series of solution interviews and gradually increasing fidelity. So let's see. There's another kind of. Oh, that works really well. Awesome. Another diagram that I'll show for you guys. I'll do it up here. This is really conceptual. It's not like a quantitative graph, but there's sort of this graph of you've got like the level of uncertainty in your project, right, over time, and then you sort of got like the level of fidelity of the experiments that you're running, right? And so what you want to see is you're driving your uncertainty about the market and the product down at the same time that you're gradually increasing the fidelity of your experiments. So if by fidelity, I mean how slick is it and how long did it take you to make it, right? So you can actually kind of tick off these different phases, right? So our personas in problem interviews are like way, way down here. We used paper and email and the phone in our face. Like that's not a very expensive experiment, right? So it's a low fidelity experiment. But we've learned something. So we drive the uncertainty about our product market fit down a little bit. And then we sort of graduate. We've earned the permission by learning to do another experiment of slightly higher fidelity. So in this case, we might actually sketch out a solution, maybe on paper, maybe do some mocks or prototypes, or you can use a digital tool. You can do clickable prototypes. That stuff's getting faster and cheaper and easier to use these days. But before there were a lot of good mock-up tools, we'd definitely go paper first because it's super fast. Like we all can sketch. Maybe the UX guy on the team is driving most of this, but all of us are doing a little bit of contribution. And then you get a bunch of people and you show them the thing. And you say like, all right, you have these problems. We've validated that. Maybe they're the same people. Maybe you follow up with them. Or maybe you just find very similar people who you now already know what their problems are. And then you're like, okay, well, here's our solution. You would walk through this, and then you'd go to this screen, like, what do you think? And you're getting their feedback, right? And you go through as many rounds of that as possible, because every time you show them stuff, they're going to be confused by the workflow. They won't understand what this button does, and you'll get all this rich feedback, and you can continue to do new iterations, right? So you might build a landing page experiment with your value proposition on it, and buy a bunch of Facebook ads and throw them at the landing page and see if people respond. Do people sign up? Do they give you their email address, right? So all these things that you're trying to get, the ultimate validation obviously is revenue, like do people pay for a solution? But even before you get to revenue, you're still getting different kinds of currency from people. With the interviews, what you're getting is their time and their willingness to talk to you about their problems or to talk to you about your solution. So you sort of earn that from them. As you get further down and you're doing sort of value proposition tests where you're putting up landing pages and seeing if you can get an early sign-up list, then people are giving you their email address. And, it's a precious thing for a lot of people, right? It's like, yeah, I'll give you my email address. I'm interested in hearing when this product is ready. You'll reach out to me, right? So that's another experiment. And then gradually there's an actual working piece of software, perhaps, that maybe it's still a little clunky, maybe it's not perfectly, all the bugs aren't worked out, but like it's starting to solve the problem, right? So for an example, I recently ran a 3-month project with a team where we were building an app to solve a problem. We started with an idea, and at the end of the project, we had a working thing out in the world. Somewhere in the middle, we built a version of our product just using Google Docs, like Google Forms and spreadsheets and email and some video chat software. And we ran them through a sort of we called it a concierge test, which is basically you're doing the product with yourself rather than building software. So it's all manual, but the workflow and the results for the user as far as delivering value on their problem were basically the same, right? And so what that showed us is, did we have the right user flows, right? Would people actually interact with us, answer these questions, give us this data, let us show them this report at the end, and did they find the report valuable? Because that's what our app was proposing to do. And we ran through a bunch of people and got really good data. And we even changed a few key wordings of some things because we got feedback from them as we were walking them through. And then we built the software at the end that was basically a software version of that same workflow, more or less, right? So these are all stages that we went through. So your solution interviews are going to kind of go around that iteration loop as many times as is necessary for you to get to a real working product out in the market that people will pay for. So the tips here are basically do them separately. Start with the lowest fidelity possible and kind of work your way up from there. Don't really tell them how to use the solution. You want to try to set up tests where you can sort of observe them trying to use the product if possible. This is sort of just old school usability testing stuff, right? And also, like, a lot of times until you get to this sort of last, like, it's the release. So imagine this whole chunk, that's basically existing like in here, right? It's like your first MVP is like at the end there, right? So you're not necessarily always showing the real product. You're really just trying to get engaged with their behavior and understand how they respond to the solution proposal that you're putting in front of them. And always get their email address, right? Marketing. All right, cool. I want to talk a little bit, and sort of almost the end of this section, I want to talk about metrics a bit. Could someone grab a napkin from there? I am going to try to spray this down because I want to use the board again. Cool. Thank you. So let me just clear this. So let's talk about metrics, OK? So I've put a couple things up there. So has anyone heard of pirate metrics? OK, we got a pirate metrics person in the back. All right. Pirate fan. What does pirate metrics mean? Or like, why do they call it that?
The abbreviation there, the R.
Yeah. Do you remember what they are?
Awareness, acquisition, something, retention.
Yeah. Pretty close. Pretty close. Yeah. Revenue's a big one. So so pirate metrics, coined by Dave McClure, I believe, which is really a lot of old sort of sales stuff, but he put a nice package around it to make it easy to remember. And it's called pirate metrics because if you say this out loud, you sound like a pirate, right? So easy to remember. Basically, it's acquisition, activation, retention, referral, and revenue, right? So in the way that actually I typically think about it, and this is sort of in the book as well, a colleague of mine, David Bland, that I worked with at Neo, had this really cool way of sort of drawing it in a kind of a diagram or a flow diagram, right? So you have like all of your marketing channels, right? So users are coming in to arrive at your product in some way, however you interact with them. And so you are acquiring, prospective customers. And there's some way in which they engage with your product for the first time to basically activate. Do they create an account? Do they make a purchase? Do they sign up? Do they download, install, and start adding their data into it? Like, it depends on what your product is, right? But there's some activation stage that they go through. If this actually solves the value problem for them, right? Like if that actually creates value, awesome, cool. You'll know because there'll be some retention, right? Like there'll be some key thing that they do that, at this stage they're curious. At this stage they're going to give it a shot, and if it worked for them, they'll do it again, right? They'll maintain their subscription, or they'll buy more stuff, or they'll upgrade, or whatever that sort of next level is. And if this is working really well and they're super passionate about it, if it's really nailing the problem really well, they will start to excitedly tell their friends about it, right? So there'll be another person who's like, oh, really? Cool, I'm going to try that. And then they'll try it, right? So this is your referral loop, right? So this is sort of repeat usage, right? And this is, virality, if you will. And the reason this one's good because if you're losing people here, like you're just acquiring customers and churning through them, right? Like that's very expensive and you're eventually going to die. Once you've got that nailed, right, this one allows you to have cheaper cost of acquisition because this is free acquisition, right? Like your customers are doing your marketing for you, right? So that's why virality is great. And if all of that is just kicking butt, you're generating some revenue and there's sort of like a final kind of outcome, right? So there's this little way of looking at the acquisition stuff, or the pirate metrics. For me, as far as early stage, there's another sort of metrics framework that I like to use. So this is sort of, the pirate metrics is for the customer themselves. They're kind of flowing through the product one at a time, right? I think there's another framework from the Lean Analytics book that if you haven't read it, it's really good. Alistair Kroll and Ben Yoskowitz wrote this great book called Lean Analytics. In it, there's a framework that's more complicated than what I'm going to draw, but the basic parts that I use all the time are these stages of empathy, right? Stickiness, and growth. And so the idea here for me is this is the cycle that the startup itself is going through, right? So in the beginning, you're in the empathy phase until you have solved a painful problem for a customer. So it's like, are we solving problems for customers? Do we understand the problem? Do we have the right customer? In the stickiness phase, the question is, are we solving it well enough that they actually want to use it again or continue to use it? And then once we've got that, then you start focusing on growth in terms of like, are our customers so freaking excited that they're going out and telling all their neighbors to use it, right? But there's a linearity here, right? Like you can't solve this problem if you haven't solved this problem, for example, right? Like you got to focus on these things in stages. And this maps actually nicely to this other diagram because it turns out we've discovered through lots of experiments with lots of projects that in the empathy phase, you're really just looking primarily at acquisition and activation, right? Because you're still trying to figure out if you have a problem worth solving. So I say here that for any stage, there's usually a one metric that matters. That's another lean analytics term those guys use a lot. So there's sort of a different one metric that matters, usually, depending on where you are in your startup or product's growth life cycle, right? So first, you're looking at the acquisition and activation metrics. Then, as you get further in, you're still looking at those, but now you're paying closer attention to retention, right? Like, are people actually sticking, right? And then finally, the referral metrics show up over here. And of course, revenue is always important, but this is the referral one really starts to be relevant when you're looking at growth. But you can't do growth before you've got stickiness. And you can't do stickiness until you've got empathy. So that sort of helps you think about how to organize the metrics that you might have at your disposal in terms of your marketing, in terms of people onboarding, in terms of how they use the product, in terms of how they refer the product to other people. Like all of those pieces come together in a general life cycle, right? Cool. So I have so much more to do, but I've used a lot of time. Okay. We've solved the right problem. We understand the customer. We've conducted problem and solution interviews. We're measuring our progress, and we're iterating as many times as we need. I have a whole nother chunk here on building products quickly, but there's a bunch more to cover. But I think this is important stuff. So this section is really about working with teams. So it's very hard to do all this by yourself, right? Like, in my world, which is primarily digital products, software products, so it might be mobile apps, it might be web experiences, it might be services in the cloud, like whatever it is. there's typically software being produced, right? And so I work with teams. You have probably seen diagrams like this one where it's like you've got the sort of cross-functional team. I'll come back to this in a minute in the slides, but I want to give you a preview. You sort of got product management and UX and sort of development or engineering, right? So like a good team has all of those pieces. There may be other pieces, right? There may be marketing or sales or biz dev or other things. But certainly a digital product development team has all of these things, right? It has all those skills. And they may or may not be one or more people, right? And for me, the best teams are where they sort of overlap a little bit in their skill sets, right? So like the UX people and the developers can kind of talk to the same language. Like the UX guys know the tools they're working with. They can code a little bit. They're familiar with CSS, like all that stuff. The developers are like not completely ignorant of design principles. They understand human-computer interaction. They know layout, like that kind of stuff, et cetera, with each of the different skills crossing each other, right? So like a really good team is working together. So in fact, the book focuses a lot on this concept because I think that there's a misconception in the Valley, disproven a million times, and yet people still cling to it, that the best companies that have been built are sort of, led by this heroic champion that kind of drag the company kicking and screaming to success. But it's really that singular individual and their almost insanity that survives. Really, like products are built by teams of people, typically, right? So there is a really strong element of teamwork here that I think is very unappreciated. And so that's what I talk about mostly. So let's talk about how do we build products quickly. These are a couple key pieces that I think about. One is you have to define the work very clearly in a way that everyone on the team kind of knows what we're building, right? So there's a way of organizing the features, right? So at this point, we've gone through all of this problem interview, solution stuff. We have a pretty good idea of what we're building now. We're going to make this MVP. We're going to get it to market as fast as possible. We know it has aspects, features. People are going to log in. They're going to create an account. There's going to be data. There's going to be views. There's going to be some sort of flow of clicking through screens, whatever it is, right? So we have to define that work, right, in some way. So I use user stories from Agile. I find it to be very effective. We've been using them for 25 years. It seems to work. So I would suggest that you do the same. I think that once you've got all these user stories defined and people are starting to work on them, it's really important to keep track of who is working on what on the team and like where are you in the list of things to do. So we typically use a visualization system, right? And I've got individual slides for each of these, so I'll go through them. And then, as I said, teams, for me, the best teams are cross-functional, like that, co-located, meaning they're all in the same room, and dedicated, meaning they're not working on anything else. They're just working on this product all day long together, right? You don't always have all of those things, and I'll talk about that, but that's the goal. That's what you want to optimize for. If you're missing some of those, it's harder. I won't kid you. If you're missing 2 of those 3, it's very hard. Your chances of success are low. But if you're missing 1, you can sort of optimize, right? So, and I'll get into the details of these things in a second. And then finally, there's sort of, this is kind of related to that too, and I know this seems really vague and esoteric, but it'll make sense in a minute. You can optimize for time with space and vice versa. In other words, if people are spread out geographically, there are ways to use time, so like synchronicity and cadence, to kind of conquer that space. Or if people are sort of necessarily working on different things and they're working at different times, you can use space as a way to optimize around that tricky time problem. So, from a human sort of organization perspective, time and space can be sort of traded off with each other if you must. So I'll show you how to do that. First, let's talk about user stories. So, old-fashioned extreme programming agile guy that I am, I like user stories that are very simple. And they do things like spell out who the user is and what they're trying to do and what it means to them, right? So like as a salesperson like Jack, I want to store all of my deals in a pipeline view so it's easy to see who I got to make the next call to, right? Like that's a user story, right? That's actually you'd probably be a little more detailed than that. But in any case, like it's a way of keeping the requirements for the software very much focused on the user and value to them. So user stories that are not good are things like that this database connects to that service and data flows between them. It's like, so, right? Like who's that for? Why are we doing this, right? Use a simple format, low fidelity visuals. So I tend to focus on using software to manage the look and feel of things. So we have all of these great frameworks for organizing look and feel, right? Like we've got Bootstrap and stuff like that, or sort of like libraries of components that can be developed so that you're not spending all of your time trying to draw high fidelity versions of everything repeatedly and then having the developer kind of decrypt that into code. It's a lot easier for everyone to sort of agree on the design foundations, like technically and visually what's going to be there. So then you can just make quick sketches, right? Like we all know what the form fields look like, so I just want a form field here that's like this, and it's labeled that and blah. So the teams that I've worked on that have been very, very fast have had that design development sort of balance where sort of come together and agree on tools to use to really do all the heavy lifting of the design, and then the communication between them is super lo-fi, just like sketches, because they already know what the other one is talking about, right? Whereas in the old days when I used to get these incredibly detailed pixel perfect designs in Photoshop or whatever and then would have to convert them somehow into a web page, like there was a lot of lost time and a lot of confusion and that sort of thing. So, and then finally, like there should be some definition of done on the user story. Like we should know like how would we actually test this? What is the user going to do? And what data changes, or what does the screen look like when they've accomplished this task, right? So those are user stories. So stop me. Go ahead.
Based on your experience, approximate these user stories which you're creating, the duration, which duration approximately you take? 1 week? I'm sure
Okay.
that based on that, 1 month is too hard to manage.
Yeah.
Probably you're just taking as a 1 week or 1 day. So what's your experience based on creating the tasks as a user stories based on the durations?
Right. So typically, yeah. So there's sort of like two pieces of your question. I think the second part I'll get to, which is about how to sort of organize into cadences with like the team. As far as the size of these things, like how to scope them, we try to make them as small as possible, right? So as simple. Well, I don't think of it in terms of time. I think of it in terms of scope, right? So it's like, what's the simplest possible thing that will achieve this and that's still shippable, right? Like it could be delivered to the user and that they would actually be able to get some value out of it, right? So it's like you wouldn't do a user story where you could edit a thing but not delete it, right? Like there's sort of like a package of functionality that has to be of value to the user. If it's too small or too sort of incremental, it might not be valuable.
Sometimes there's kind of problems which you face. If we're just too small and doing the task, 1 day, 2 days, it's too hard to see the whole picture per 1 month or per 2 months, right? So it's kind of problems. Initially, we started planning based on the 2 months plan.
Right.
It's too hard to manage.
Right.
And then we divide it to the pieces. But then if we're dividing to pieces, we can also do the ends. So it's kind
Yeah.
of issue.
Well, let me see if I answer it a little bit, and then we can sort of come back around. So a couple tips for user stories. Don't make them too detailed. Rely instead on frequent communication between people. It's really just an anchor to get a shared understanding of how you're delivering value to the customer. That's why I kind of keep them like high level. There's just a sentence like, as a user, I want to do blah so that I can blah. And then like we talk because, it happens that we're sitting in the same room, or we have regular daily check-ins. So that communication between team members really makes things go faster. I mentioned already, sort of avoid high fidelity mocks, mostly because they lie. They lie by omission and they lie by assumption. So it's better to sort of use a design framework or a component library or something and then just use sketches or quick notations to kind of refer to those pieces that are already designed. Definition of done should be as verifiable with data as possible. So done is not subjective. Like it's either done or it's not, right? So when it's done, we can run this automated test and it passes, right? Like that's done. Versus like, it sort of looks a little bit off and, move it over, right? So you have to have something very concrete, right? Now, as far as what you do with all these stories, right? So we've got our grand idea for our product, and we've got our stories on our little cards, either in a digital tool or stickies on the wall or whatever. And you've got a bunch of them, right? And we kind of lay them all out based on what we think the priority is for getting our most important MVP out the door. So you've got a bunch of stories in order, and they're all sort of on this long list, and we're going to start working on them now, right? So now we need to have some kind of system for how to organize the work. So I refer to a Kanban system in a very broad sense, right? So Kanban at its simplest is basically some visual control board. It could be digital, like Trello or something like that. It could be you're literally the wall in the room. And what you do is you basically have columns, and everything flows in this direction, right? That's an arrow, sorry. So you have to do, doing, and done, right? You might have more columns in the doing. It depends on how big the team is and how many different specializations there are. But in a small, tight team, we would basically have a Kanban system like this. And at first, we'd usually start with just a whiteboard on the wall. But if people are remote and you're trying to coordinate, then you need to use a digital tool like Jira or Trello or something like that. But like all of those tools have boards like this now. Like this is sort of how we do it. It's in Scrum, it's in Kanban. And the idea here is that anyone can see what things are in progress and what's done at any given time, right? So the idea is that it's all about flow. It's all about how fast can you ship these pieces to the final sort of server ready to go to the customer. How fast can you get that done, right? Because remember, getting to market fast is the name of the game here, right? Because everyone else is trying to do it too. And you don't want your competition to eat your lunch. So it's all about flow. It's all about being able to visualize what's going on so that team members can coordinate with each other. And you basically want to focus on a couple different things. One is you want to limit the number of things that the team is working on at the same time, right? So for me, I will typically, and like if I'm managing an engineering team, I'll typically enforce a rule that we're only ever working, if we're working as individual developers, it's one thing per person. If we're doing pair programming and we're working in a pair, which a lot of the teams I've worked with have, then it's one thing per pair, right? And maybe we have like an extra thing, just in case. So like a 6-person team that their pair programming is 3 pairs of 2. We might have a work in process limit is what we call it, of 4. So we're never allowed to have more than 4 things in here at a time. Because pair A is working on that one, pair B is working on this one, pair C is working on this one. We might have an extra thing, and if anybody kind of gets stuck and has to wait to finish this one, then they can start working on that one, right? But the problem that you often see, the problem that this is trying to solve, is that a lot of times you have developers that will start working on this for a while and start working on that for a while, and they've got like all these things in progress, and everything slows to a crawl. And that's basically because people can't multitask. They think they can, but science says no. You don't actually multitask. It's much better to have you focus on shipping that one thing and moving on to the next thing than to try to do a whole bunch of things at a time. Which gets back to the definition of stories, right? Because you need to scope stories in such a way that you can completely finish a story and ship it, right? So that's a little bit of a hint of how you organize your stories. And then finally, if you want to know whether you're going fast or not, you have to measure the amount of time it takes to make it across this board, right? So the very simple way to do that is to timestamp when things get pulled in and then when they're done. So two timestamps on every card. And then you've got a nice chart at the end of how your stuff is getting done, right? So you can end up with something that's kind of like what we call, in lean systems, it's a control chart, right? So you're sort of over time, you're getting these measurements of time, how long it took them to get done, right? Like if something up here took a really long time, these guys down here were really fast. And so we're collecting every time something gets done, you're sort of gathering over time, and you can sort of statistically figure out what your average is, right? Like how long does it typically take something to get across? That's called cycle time, right? You guys can look that up. Cycle time is really important because when you're measuring cycle time, you can see how fast things will get done. And you can see if you're getting faster, if you're improving. You could also predict when things that are down the backlog will get done. Because if we know it's going to take an average amount of time X to get across the board, and we know how many things are in the list, you can just use math to figure out the lead time on that thing that's 20 items deep, right? So that's just sort of basic lean stuff. Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So here's what we're doing. So this is sort of over sort of calendar time, right? So as we're going, we're keeping track. Like when things finish, we take those two timestamps, the beginning and end. We calculate the distance. So this took 2 days to complete, and we mark it on this scale of how long it took to complete. So this is the time it took to finish each task, and we're plotting them as the days go by, right? So you're getting an average of how long things take to finish. And then you might find a few outliers, right? So like, wow, why did this task take 7 days when the average is 2 days? And you can actually do a retrospective to look at this task and sort of see, was there something funky about it? Would we have to wait for some dependency? Was it harder than we thought it was going to be? And you can kind of plan around that, right? All right. So if you don't measure cycle time, it's hard to see improvement, right? Yeah?
Quick question also.
Sure.
Is there any reason why you don't do Scrum and use a sprint instead of doing it that way?
I do sometimes. I think there's a much longer discussion to be had around the difference between velocity, which is a measurement in Scrum, and cycle time. I've found from experience that cycle time is a much more real measure because you're just using actual historical data to see how long it takes things to ship. The measure of velocity is abstracted a couple layers because what the team is doing is it's guessing at how hard things are and making story point estimates around the difficulty. And then it's calculating how many of those story points it's finishing in a given amount of time, which is sort of like this, but it's sort of proxied out a couple layers, right? Rather than just directly measuring the shipping time, right? So I find cycle time a little more useful than velocity, but it's practically, it's still a big argument in the Agile community of sort of which is better, right? This is my preference. And then limiting work in process, as we talked about, it reduces batch sizes, right? So it reduces the amount of work that is getting shipped, and that makes cycle time go faster. I can't get into the science behind a lot of this stuff because I'm going way over time, but if you want to talk more about this, we can. Here's one that might surprise the managers in the room. It's also really a good idea to not worry so much about individual productivity, but to watch the overall throughput of the team itself, right? Like I said in the beginning, products are built by teams. There's not like any one person on your team who is sort of heroically finishing everything, or we would hope that that's not the case. You really want to watch the flow of work, not the individuals on the team. I'm being a somewhat hyperbolic here. Yes, there's some times where you have to intervene. There's a particular team member that needs some help, or you got to work with people around that. But usually it's much more efficient to just get the team working cooperatively to ship things as fast as possible than worrying about like this developer writes more lines of code per day than that developer. Like, I don't care. I just want to see value to the user, and like however the team configures itself to make that happen, it's great. So We're getting into some team stuff. I'm at 110. So I've been talking for a while. Do you guys, well, let's see. There's probably a few more slides around teamwork I can do, or we can, yeah. Let me cover a few more things, but then I'll stop early and we can try to like see if there's any remaining questions. I probably won't be able to get through everything. But I think there's a few key ideas here, and it's related to this distance problem, right? So cross-functional teams. Everyone sits together, work on a few things at a time. That's that problem. And try to reduce the handoffs between roles, right? So what do I mean by a handoff? Is basically, if you have a workflow where there's a bunch of specializations, what you want to do is try to reduce the amount of handoffs between, like, someone creates the design, they design the whole site, they hand those stack of designs over to the developer starts working on it. Halfway through the stack, they discover there's some sort of mistake that the designer didn't anticipate, and they kind of have to like reject the whole stack and go back and that sort of thing. It's much easier to take one story, right? Have the designer and developer work pretty seamlessly together, so there's less of a batch handoff on that story, because you'll get a quicker sense of feedback between the different specializations, and you can ship faster and have fewer mistakes and less rework, right? Here are my tips on cross-functional teams. So separating design from development work creates larger batches, and larger batches increase cycle time. So, and remember, we want to reduce our cycle time as much as possible, because low cycle time equals fast. Working on too many stories at once creates dependencies, and more dependencies increase cycle time. So you want to try to work on as few things as possible, nicely scoped, shippable, everybody working together. Handoffs between functions create queues, which is kind of just another word for batches, right? So if you have like the QA team down here, and you've got like the engineering team, and they're sort of throwing things over the wall, you've got a big stack of things that are piling up here. Well, that's going to take a while to get shipped, right? Like there's a big inbox of things that have to be tested, and now everybody's kind of waiting for the testers to get finished, right? So you want to try to reduce those queues in between steps as much as possible, which you can do by reducing the WIP limits, like reducing the amount of things people are allowed to work on at a time, and also creating more cross-functional collaboration between team members, right? All right.
Is this what Spotify's squad model is based on?
Yeah, in a way. Yeah, there's definitely elements to that matrix organization that tries to solve. This is one of the problems that tries to solve, right? Sort of a lot of companies I know still are sort of built around these like functional silos, and things get sort of handed over the wall, and just like the time from concept to shipping is just very, very long. And that's one of the reasons, because what we've found is that the amount of cycle time from idea to ship is usually made up a lot more in companies like that of wait time between steps than it is actual work time on the things, right? Like things are sort of queued up waiting for the next person, and they're just sitting there rotting, basically. So if throughput is important, if getting things to market fast is important, you want to try to collapse the number of handoffs and collapse the amount of things people are working on at once to as small as possible, right? So think tight, tight, tight. Like bring people in geographically, bring them in conceptually and functionally, and try to get people working more as a collaborative on single units or small numbers of things, rather than having a functional silo that builds up a queue and then hands it over to the next one, and then they work it down and hand it over to the next one, right? That just creates a lot of delay. So I've got a couple other things that I think will address some of the questions that we've had, and I'm just going to blast through these fast. So please forgive me because I'm way over time. All right, optimizing space and time. So here's where things always get sort of controversial. So this will be fun. There is no substitute for co-location on product development teams, right? So the ideal scenario is everybody's in the same room. And I know that a lot of teams are built in a distributed way, and that can be very hard. I personally work with people all over the world, and so I'm perfectly familiar with how challenging it is to get a co-located team. But it would be the best thing, right? Because the amount of fast feedback when people are just in the room and can kind of stop and talk to each other and ask questions is just orders of magnitude more efficient than having conference calls at 10 p.m. my time because I'm talking to someone in Singapore or Hyderabad or Switzerland or wherever it is, right? It's just very, very difficult because you've got this like 24-hour wait time between all of the check-ins, right? Whereas when we're all sitting at the same table and we're eating lunch together and we're constantly talking back and forth, it's much, much faster to catch mistakes or miscommunications or assumptions that we're making, right? Co-location builds trust. So people tend to go and have lunch together or go out for beers or hang out at the water cooler and like, don't dismiss that stuff, right? Because teams really need to have trust in order to work efficiently together, because if I'm building part of something and you're building part of something and we're kind of trusting each other to, respect each other and have each other's back on that product, when we go out to lunch and talk about like our golfing trip that weekend or like, my kid was up late because of whatever, like it creates this sort of human bond that's very difficult to sort of, recreate remotely, I guess. So this is just another reason why this kind of closeness is really important with teams that are going to be working together on the same thing. However, there is this thing called Conway's Law that's kind of interesting, and you can use it to your advantage if you are working with remote resources, or, oh, I did it again. I hate calling people resources, and it's so ingrained in our culture that I sometimes slip. Anyway, if you're working with people who are remote, Conway's Law basically states that organizations that develop knowledge systems tend to create architectures that mirror the communication patterns of the organization, right? So that means like the way that we're organized in our company, departments, buildings, that kind of stuff, we sort of subconsciously produce an architecture that really looks a lot like the company, right? And so folks have figured this out. Certainly people at some of the bigger tech companies, the Amazons and Netflixes of the world, have used Conway's Law to their advantage. They've figured out how they need their systems to be built. Let's think of like these small kind of composable microservices. Well, there are whole cross-functional teams that are responsible for a single service, right? And they're all located together. I'm generalizing, it's probably not always the case. But the idea is that if you're going to build a system that has different components that have to talk to each other, you can organize things so that the teams are built around those components in such a way as, the team building component A are all located in, say, Poland, and the team working on component B are all in, say, Idaho. And there's an API that those two components are going to talk to each other about. And the APIs are mostly what those teams talk about to coordinate. But internally, the team is all co-located and building that one service together, right? So you're sort of using Conway's Law to your advantage to organize your remote folks around the architecture that you're planning to produce that's most efficient, right? And the sort of the opposite of that, which I would not do, is to have a single product component where like the interface is being built in London and the back-end engineer or the development work is being done in New York for the same sort of website, for example. Like I wouldn't do that. I would have the designer in New York. Maybe you could do like a microservice that the website talks to and they're all in a different space, but you don't want to like functionally split people geographically if you can avoid it. So co-location reduces the number of meetings because we're all here, so we can just talk. It's very easy. Like we might go in a room to have a conversation around something, but there's lots of more FaceTime sort of ad hoc communication. So you're reducing cycle time, right? Because we're not waiting for that meeting where we're all in different time zones to make a decision, right? Co-location results in casual social behaviors. We talked about that as well. It builds trust among team members, and trust helps teams move faster. It also reduces turnover, right? Because when people trust each other, they tend to stay in the job longer. They don't look for another job because they're happy with their coworkers because they trust them. Remote teams require more communication, and more communication over distance just results in slower feedback loops, which increases cycle time and makes it harder to ship. So the moral of the story here is if you're working with people over distance on the same product, it will probably take longer to ship the product than were you all in the same room. And I don't want to make your economic decisions for you, but from my own opinion, I've gotten in a lot of interesting debates with peers and clients and colleagues that when people use remote resources, typically they're justifying it by cost. They're saying, those people over there are cheaper. And I say, okay, well, how much cheaper are they? How much is a developer in San Francisco worth? I don't know, let's call it $100K a year if you're lucky. It's a junior guy, it's all right. So, you know, you've got a developer in another part of the world, right? Like, I don't know, you know, Eastern Europe or India or Vietnam or Uruguay or whatever. It's like, so maybe the salaries are cheaper in those places, perhaps, but like how much, really? And when I've looked, it's not orders of magnitude. It's a fraction. Maybe it's half. Maybe it's less than half. Maybe it's more like 80%. But it's like, they're a little far off, sure. So you're saying, okay, well, we're going to save all this money because maybe this person's 50K instead of 100K. You know, it's like double, right? Fine. It turns out that working with that person over that distance compared to working, like two developers who both cost 100K are going to be able to communicate orders of magnitude faster than trying to coordinate with someone who is 24 hours away, right? Or not 20, you know, in a 12-hour distance, right? So because the amount of feedback time between people that are working on that same product can be much, much, much faster if they're even in the same time zone than if you're trying to optimize that coordination day by day. And the only time you have to check in is when the two time zones happen to overlap. So you have that one-day call where people can't see each other and everybody's like confused and like you spend the whole meeting trying to get ramped up on what you're supposed to talk about, and then we're out of time. Like that's how most of these go. It's very confusing and frustrating, and so things that could take a day or two to ship at this, you know, and that's true in either place, right? Like it's the same thing if it's have everybody who's in one spot building together, because they're going to be iterating so much faster and shipping their version so much faster than trying to coordinate across several different time zones. So I repeatedly debunked the economic argument for having people across the globe, unless it's really around that Conway's Law organization where, well, these folks all know each other, they know the particular domain, they're building like the AI engine and they all went to school together and so they're in this office in this particular country and they're going to build that part. And then our other team is going to interact with that part over an API that's very clearly defined. That's totally fine, right? But this whole like splitting it functionally on the same component across geographies, it's just a mess. So I'm going to stop. We've done user stories. We've done Kanban systems, visual workflow systems. We've talked a lot about cross-functional, co-located, dedicated teams, and a little bit about time and space. And I've just got to stop talking now. So we'll go to questions from here. But thank you.
Some questions. Anyone from here? Does anyone have a question?
Suzanne, great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, so how might we use this for hardware products? Is it directly applicable?
Yeah. Yes and no. So, and I've definitely gotten that question a lot, and I've thought about it a lot, and it's more and more relevant these days. It seems like there's more sort of, you've got like IoT and 3D printing and all kinds of stuff like that. I think that the general principles still hold. A lot of the principles that I've referred to here originate from lean manufacturing, as it turns out, right? So lean startup and agile both derive ultimately from the sort of old school lean manufacturing principles, right? So I think the idea of being able to talk to customers first is relevant in any context. So one example is from the design thinking world. If you go and do like workshops or observe students at the D school or places where they do a lot of design thinking, they do some software stuff, but they tend to do a lot of like service design or hardware products or consumer like physical products. And they absolutely take a very iterative sort of prototyping approach. So building empathy with the customer is always important. Like, are you still solving a problem that matters? It's obviously different to produce an MVP physically than it is to produce software, for sure. But people are doing it. People are doing smaller batch runs, right? So you can produce prototype hardware components. I mean, I'm not a deep like semiconductor guy, so like I don't know about every possible technical component, but I'm thinking more about like physical products that have pieces customers hold and push and move and click and all that kind of stuff. There's also an explosion in the maker space. So there's this network of spaces that are coming up all the time around like laser cutting and 3D printing and I don't know, all kinds of ways of producing physical products on a small batch scale that people could kind of get their hands dirty with those tools and produce a bunch of them and then take them out to market and see if they work with customers. And then you haven't done like 100,000 or 1 million units. You've done maybe like 100, right? So I think those principles are still there. I don't know exactly which ones, but it would be worth like doing an article or something trying to figure out like how would you do this slightly differently for hardware. In fact, if you know of people doing hardware stuff that I could talk to, I'd love to get some insight into how to apply this stuff.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
So I used to be a PM at Cisco.
Okay.
And
speaking of hardware.
And during the high-flying days, Cisco was a market leader in many of the products they were in.
Right.
And the customers, when we went and talked to them, they would tell us, hey, you are the leader, you tell us what to do, right? So we wouldn't actually get any feedback. Yeah, we would get some feedback on the interfaces of for telephony products and those type of things, but the future type of stuff, right?
Sure.
You're the leader, you figure it out and let us know, right?
Right.
So it's very counter to what you suggest.
Not exactly, because what I'm not asking you to do is have the customer tell you what they want. Like what I was trying to say was trying to figure out, understanding what they do and where their problems are. Like, you're not asking them to design the solution for you. You're really trying to build an understanding of where are things that they're using now not working for them. Right? Like, show me your environment, right? That's very easy for them to do. Like, you don't ask them like, oh, tell us what you want us to make for you, right? Like, that wouldn't be successful. But what you certainly can do is you can say, hey, you're in this context, you're trying to do this work, we know the space, we know what the competitive landscape is, are you using these tools? Show us how you use them. Like, where are they falling flat for you? Like, where are the gaps? So you can sort of dig deeper, but you're definitely not asking them to tell you what to make, right? Like, there is this level of you have to envision a solution yourself that solves the problem, right? So it's sort of different. Yeah. Anyone else have any questions? Or yeah.
Another question. So the first thing you do is you learn and validate the problem, right?
Do we need the mic? Okay, sure. Okay.
Yeah. In your flow, the first thing you go out is interview and validate and discover and validate the problem.
Sure.
To solve. That's the first thing. Then you do the solution, right? My question is this: typically, I think discovering the problem, I imagine, is the more challenging side of things. And then once you know that well, it just not a slam dunk, but it's like a fairly analytical step-by-step thing to get to the solution. Is that correct or not correct?
I don't know if it's correct or not, but you definitely have something there. I mean, it's getting the problem right. And what we didn't really talk about that I would raise now, because it's useful, is also understanding that there has to be a business model behind your idea, your product. And so even if you have found the problem, it still has to make sense economically to build a business around this product, right? So it's like, are people willing to pay to solve that problem? How much are they willing to pay to solve that problem? Can we build something cheaply enough to actually ship it so that we make money doing this, right? There's a whole array of assumptions baked in. And I think that where I've seen the most startups fall down or initiatives kind of die is, as you're saying, around like people will kind of get wrapped around a particular customer segment and try to see if they can find a problem worth solving and just, not get anywhere and have to move on to a totally different idea or a totally different market segment. So you're right, like finding the problem is hard. I'm actually doing it for a side project with a friend right now, and we know what we want to make. We're both software engineers, and we're like, all right, he's already made an MVP. They're like, we're kind of like we have sort of a mock-up, and we're like itching to do it, but we're trying. We both coach this stuff, and we're trying to, listen to our own advice.
Now you have a technology looking for a problem.
Yeah, right. That's what we're worried about, right? Like we're like, well, we could just make it, but like we really should follow our own advice and go through the steps of talking to people and seeing if they have the problem. Because we started with a problem that we have, so we think that everybody has it. But like, we've already talked to a few people and there's some surprising answers. And then we're kind of like, now it's like we might have to make something different if we want to pursue that. Or we could just say, what the heck, and make our thing anyway. But then it's sort of like, do we really want it to succeed or not? Or is it really just a hobby thing for us, right? So this is definitely a weird gray area there. Yeah. Anyone else? Any other final thoughts, comments? I also take comments.
So the other thing I was wondering was if you look at products like YouTube and Twitter, I don't know if they had a business plan when they started.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they had user stories, all those things. They threw something there. Maybe over time they evolved,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
Twitter is another example. Right?
Sure. They still don't have a business model.
Yeah, so I don't know if you had any thoughts. Maybe it doesn't apply to.
I have to defend Twitter. I mean,
Sorry. They're easy to make fun of.
I'm making right now.
Yeah.
So just to be sure, and I think the revenue is slightly more than everybody else's revenue here.
Sure. It was a cheap shot, for sure. I actually like Twitter.
Twitter was again birthed out of another startup.
Right, Odeo.
So, and it was basically birthed out of exactly what you're talking about, that people wanted to communicate in simplicity. So it was actually birthed out of something else.
Yeah.
So, and same thing with Slack.
Yeah, sure.
I know we're all anti-Slack here, but
Yeah. No, I love Slack. I use it all the time. Yeah.
But the whole idea was that the definition of engineers is to love to slack off. And that's why they named it Slack, which is true. You ask every
Yeah.
engineer, he works really hard 3 days before the deadline.
Yeah.
What about Asana? Have you before?
I've used Asana, but I kind of played with it. But I use Jira.
Yeah, sure.
And part of it is past addictions, and anyway, it's more psychological than anything else.
Yeah.
But to answer this question, but they went through God knows how much money out of the previous startup to come up with some
Yeah.
cool idea.
Slack was a different company too, right? So like all of these, there was a lot of pivoting going on, right? So like Twitter was essentially an accident, you could say. Like they built something internally that they wanted to use, and people used it in unexpected ways, and yeah, that can definitely happen, And if you have a couple,
Conservative model. This is not a blue ocean type, solution that you're looking for. Twitter was more like blue ocean. Same thing with Slack.
Yeah.
But this is more conservative.
Well, there's confirmation bias here, right? So it's like we're looking at the successes. So like how if you have a couple $100 million you want to toss around and try to come up with something like Slack or Twitter or Facebook or whatever, like you're welcome to it. Like the Silicon Valley is littered with the bones of people that had equally interesting ideas that didn't stick and spent just as much money. So like you can't just look at the ones that have survived as a way of pattern matching backwards to what worked. Like you have to kind of compare it to all the things that didn't work, right? Like so, and I think that when you look at product development has also evolved in the time that, Slack, I don't know folks that work there very well, but I know that Michael Lopp is the VP there now, and like he very much, I think embraces a lot of these same principles too. Like I know that the teams that work there, they very much do follow these kinds of things, right? It wasn't the first chat networking office productivity app, like we had HipChat and other things before that. But there's some way in which they approached this particular problem that they were solving, and they nailed it, right? Like their product development philosophy is all over their blog, and it's very clearly philosophically in line with the same things that we're talking here. Like Twitter, I think, was sort of more before a lot of this stuff was coming out, like 2006 or 5 or whatever it was. Like there was no lean startup yet. Like Agile was sort of barely adopted. It was a previous time. So, I think you have to be fair with the comparisons, I guess, Yeah.
Just one question about the Kanban.
Sure.
You have mentioned that to do, doing, and done.
Yeah.
Comparing that, first of all, what's your suggestion? Do you think that practically, all your previous startups, actually, these 3 steps is good, or you prefer to just do more steps first? If, for example, there's 10 people. For example, in my cases, I had a real serious problem. I also just started to doing, tested, done,
Yeah,
etc. So,
sure.
but what I had faced is to-do lists. I had plenty of them because team is big. So what I did, I just tried to do, and the name of the developer, name of persons, just make it more easier based on Kanban. That was also not so success. So right now I have kind of gaps. I just moved from Kanban to the list, just normal list view based on the names.
Right.
So what's your suggestion first? My question is that practically, for example, did you do this approach and it worked or not?
Yeah, I've done this dozens and
question,
dozens of times.
There's a big teams, so how you can suggest me to divide these steps? Just such question.
Sure. So to do something like this requires that the doers that are working in this box can all do any of these, right? So it's queuing theory, right? Like you go to the supermarket. Well, the supermarket's not a great example. You go to the bank, and there's a single line, and you've got a bunch of tellers, right? Like every teller can service anyone in the line, right? So we're in the line, and we're the to-do list. And we get up, and like each of the tellers can service anyone just as easily. And some of them get locked, and they take a long time, but you can just go to the other ones, right? So you can measure, next time you go to the bank, if you're ever physically in the bank again for some reason. I know we don't go to the bank that much these days. I was in one the other day, so that's why I'm thinking of this. Or anywhere with a line, Starbucks with a bunch of cashiers, just play with this lead time idea, right? So that's the first part, right? One is they all can do the same things, right? So if that's true, if we're going to optimize for the fact that any one of these folks can pull the next thing as soon as there's space, like as soon as A is done, there's now a space here, so then we can pull the next thing. That requires that person or team is just as capable as everybody else in the team of doing any one of these things. So I personally never try to bind tasks ahead of time to anyone on the team, because it sort of locks in things in a way that can slow stuff down, right? Like it breaks that queuing theory approach of having of any server being able to service the queue, right? So if you're going to do that, then you have 2 choices. One, you have a bunch of individuals who all are generalists, right? Like they can all do all parts of the story, or you organize into cross-functional teams that have all the pieces they need in individual people, but they're together as a team, and they stay as a team, and then they act as a server, right? So it's either like all 10 engineers are more or less the same, and they can all kind of do all the stories, or you put them in groups where each group can do all the stories, right? So that's how I would do it.
So from the start to the end, for example, let's take 6 months duration of the project. So you were success to do this approach.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I've implemented this more times than I can count.
A lot of it depends on your the sprint planning approach. So it depends on how low your team. So he's talking about pretty much generalists that you don't have to worry about, you know, individual person's skill sets. But you know, it becomes challenging. It's kind of hard to find that kind of things, especially in larger companies. People can do certain things.
Yeah.
So it's part of your sprint loading task, and then you have to, because of dependencies, what you have to do is every day make sure that people's estimations are true. So when I used to be in a larger organization, people would constantly keep sandbagging. We talk about story points.
Yeah.
And then they always say they don't have information. So basically, I would schedule meetings way into the evening, and people agree very fast. Right? Yeah, I'll do it. I need to go home now. I said, great. You know, let's get
Social engineering, yeah, totally.
I would schedule it at 2 o'clock, and
Yep.
it would run to 7 o'clock. You know, but and everybody wants to
right?
do
So
it.
if it's a creative meetings, I mean, the people need
No,
to
but
face
this is
and
a sprint
decide.
planning. No,
Okay.
this is sprint planning. So
Yep.
normally what happens is at this stage, you're discussing what needs to be done, who's willing to do it, and how long are they gonna take, you know? And so you gotta figure out, if you're dealing with larger teams, you know, you gotta understand the company culture and the individual culture, what happens.
Right.
And the dependencies, and you have to monitor this every day, otherwise somebody is not gonna have what they need to get done. And so it's more of an art plus science.
All right, awesome. Thank you. We have to invite you, Tiago, to give us a lecture about your experience as well. All right, awesome. So that's it. Any final words, Sam?
Nope.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That was very interesting and I think very
Thanks, guys.
productive. Thank you everyone for coming. We have another event on the 18th. It's going to be viral growth. I'll email you about it. And yeah, and feel free to send me any feedback if you have any. Thank you. Bye-bye.